Okay, sir.
So let me introduce Dr. Pujari, Sanjay Pujari. He's an expert in infectious diseases, and has number of awards. He's not told us to tell, but the government of India is consulting him. He's on the ICMR committee, which asks him for advice as to what is to be done. And of course, in Pune Hospital, we keep picking his head for everything about infection and now corona. So he's going to tell us something, what is actually the situation, what is possibly the situation, and because a lot of things are new for everybody. So let us try to wade through this difficult topic and time. Sanjay, over to you.
Is my slide visible, sir?
Very much, yeah.
Okay, so good afternoon, everybody, and let me at the outset thank Dr. Kothari for giving me this opportunity to present perhaps one of the most difficult lectures of my life, because it's something which is very dynamic, very little evidence to really synthesize and give information. So, but what I'm basically trying to do is to give you basic principles of transmission and tools available for transmission, and just help you to imagine every situation, try to prevent that situation using those tools. The first important thing is, of course, healthcare workers are at risk during this pandemic. At present, we don't clearly know what proportion of healthcare workers get infected across the world, but it varies from being about 1% or less than 1% in countries like Korea and Singapore, versus 10% in countries like Italy or Spain, for instance. Healthcare workers have a double whammy risk. They are exposed to patients in the healthcare setups, as well as they are part of the community. So there is a likelihood that they may also get infected in the community settings. Why do healthcare setups really have this high burden of infected healthcare workers? Now, people are trying to understand the risk factors which make healthcare workers at a higher risk of developing or acquisition of a COV2. But the major thing, which was seen across Europe, as Western Europe particularly, and US, is absolutely unprepared for this epidemic, with sudden surge of cases which happened because of no containment or mitigation efforts prior to the development of these cases. Practically very limited efforts were being made in these countries, and then they suddenly saw a surge of cases, taking the entire healthcare system by surprise and not prepared to really deal with this. The other issue is, of course, we are exposed as healthcare workers to large numbers of patients who come during a pandemic with a respiratory infection, like COV2. And also for particularly aerosol generating procedures, we are exposed to high inoculum of the virus. And most importantly, in many of these Western European and US, you may have seen healthcare workers are just exhausted. They have been repurposed, just as drugs have been repurposed to treat COV2, like say chloroquine or azithromycin. We have seen healthcare workers from other specialties being repurposed to work in COVID-19 wards. And that essentially puts them at a higher risk, really, for acquisition of infection because of non-availability of training or non-availability of experience to manage intensive care. A lack of PPE has been a universal issue. We know it has been available. It is an issue even in the developed world, and the Indian government is making very great efforts trying to get across PPE to as many healthcare setups as possible. And finally, many of the measures which are normally supposed to be done in hospitals are really not done appropriately. And this lack of measures, which are actually supposed to be universal measures to prevent spread of any infections in the hospitals, have not been really complied with, taking these sectors into surprise. So then let us try to understand the basics of transmission and the controversies associated with that. Let's look at what are the tools available to us to prevent transmission. Then we will try to apply these tools in various settings, and I'm focusing predominantly on healthcare settings. And finally, give you a brief peek into the innovative strategies which may be available in the near future, which may really reduce the burden of ours and the panic that we are currently seeing secondary to transmission in the hospital care settings. Now, this is a cartoon which very clearly shows how transmission of SARS-CoV-2 happens. And this, I know everybody knows about this. This is an infected patient who basically coughs, sneezes, talks, or breathes. And you may have droplets which are present in the air, which is inhaled by somebody who's susceptible and develops, and it is deposited in the upper respiratory and the lower respiratory tract, leading to infection. So this is what we call direct or respiratory transmission. But there's another way. These respiratory droplets really fall on surfaces or objects, on phones, on stethoscope, on blood pressure equipments. And then if you're handling it, your fingers get the virus, and then these droplets are eventually landed into your nose or mouth when you touch your hand on the face. So this is indirect way of fomites. Now let us see what are the controversies associated with this. The first and most important controversy is whether it is a droplet or an aerosol infection. And if you look at this slide here, there are differences. Obviously, everybody knows droplets don't travel fast. They deposit onto surfaces. And it is now very strongly believed, there's strong evidence to suggest that majority of the transmission of CoV2 happens because of droplets. There is a concern about aerosols, which are basically smaller particles which travel at longer distances and which remain floating in the air for a longer period of time. Now, there is no direct evidence in literature to suggest that somebody has got infected through a aerosol rather than a droplet. It's, according to the CDC, very unlikely that you would have this mode of transmission over very long distances. And that is the reason why we talk about mass gatherings. And finally, long exposure to high concentrations in relatively closed environments would be where aerosols will come into important. And that is the importance of mass gatherings and trying to avoid closed environments like malls or theaters. The second important thing is we have to find out who is at risk, and that would be defined by what is called as a close contact. It's not that everybody who is roaming around in the community is susceptible to the virus. There has to be a close contact. And these definitions come both from European CDC as well as the US CDC, looking at what is a close contact of a COVID-19 case. And this is predominantly for surveillance purposes and not necessarily for clinical purposes. The most important close contact of a COVID-19 case is a household member. Then direct physical contact, shaking hands, is where you can have fomite transmission happening. Face-to-face contact for less than 2 meters for a prolonged duration of more than 15 minutes is considered to be a close contact. Closed environments, we already talked about it, mass gatherings, schools, meeting and waiting rooms. Traveling together within 1 meter distance. So if you're sitting in a car with somebody who's a suspected COVID-19, you may be able to get that infection very easily, or a close contact. What about healthcare workers? Healthcare workers providing direct care without PPE. It's very important, this word. Healthcare workers providing direct care without PPE or possible breach in PPE are considered to be close contact of a COVID-19 case. Healthcare workers within 6 feet for a prolonged period of time, like say visiting a room in which a patient is there, sitting across. Now the controversy is what is prolonged period of time. Now Singapore or Hong Kong usually define it as more than 15 minutes. But CDC has taken a very conservative approach, saying it's greater than few minutes, not defining what few is. So that is open to really investigation. Now, apart from this close contact, there are important factors which affect transmission in healthcare. First is the duration of exposure, which I already told you, and there is by and large a linear relationship between exposure time and higher risk of acquisition. A study in China demonstrated that healthcare workers who are doing long duties, more than 8 hours, 10 hours in COVID hospitals, had a higher risk of acquisition than healthcare workers who did short duties. And that is the importance of the duration of exposure. Symptomatic patient, especially if the patient is coughing and the patient is not wearing mask. Obviously, this cough, large amount of droplets is coming onto the healthcare worker, and that is a risk which is associated with this. And this is what I mentioned. If patient wears a mask, that reduces risk. So we have, as healthcare workers, have been obsessed about getting masks for ourselves. But what is important really is to make sure patients also really get a mask when they walk in to a healthcare setup, particularly if they are coming from hotspots or if they are coming from situations where there is a high background prevalence of COVID-19 infection. The other controversy for fomites: how long does the virus stay in the environment? I'm sure everybody must have seen this paper from the New England Journal of Medicine, which looks at stability, surface stability of COVT under experimental conditions. I would like you to focus on these graphs and looking at what is the decline in the viral titers happening for all these surfaces. So whether it's aerosols, copper, cardboard, stainless steel, and plastic. So you should see very clearly that there is a linear decline in viral titers which happens over a period of time. So when we say it's there for 72 hours or 4 days or 5 days, we are looking at perhaps lower titers of the COV2. That doesn't really necessarily mean that we should not be worried about it. But the important thing is to understand methodology of these studies. One, the aerosol that was generated in this study was from a nebulizer. And that's not, nebulizer doesn't mean similar to coughing, sneezing, or talking. So that is the reason why we talk about being very careful when we talk about aerosol generating procedures. The environment in which this study was done, for aerosols, it was 65% relative humidity with a temperature of 21 to 23 degrees centigrade. And for surfaces, it was 40 degrees relative humidity with 21 to 23 degrees centigrade. So that essentially means this is the environmental condition in which that kind of stability is really seen. And finally, as I already mentioned, viable virus was detected. Surely it was detected for longer period of time, but titers was greatly reduced. And we don't know what inoculum is really needed at this point of time for the virus, for the individual to get infected once he gets exposed to the virus. Now let us go to, after understanding these basic concepts and controversies about transmission modalities, look at what are the tools available for preventing transmission. So again, we go back to our picture. So here we show the transmission. Where can we really intervene? The first point we can intervene is when a patient comes to you, give him a mask. That dramatically reduces the amount of droplets which filter through the mask and come into the environment. The second thing you can do is away, physical distancing. And this is something which keeps you away from the technically 6 feet or 1 to 2 meters, so that the respiratory droplets cannot travel that long to get deposited onto your nose and mouth. Then you can wear a mask. So that is another intervention which is available to reduce the droplets which come into your respiratory tract. As far as environmental surfaces are concerned, you can clean the environments and we will discuss about what we can do to clean environmental surfaces. About touching, you have hand hygiene. You can use hand gloves to prevent this virus from directly coming onto your hand surfaces. And if they come, you can use hand hygiene to make sure that the viruses are killed. And finally, of course, you should avoid touching face. Now, this is both for community as well as healthcare setups. Now, let us try to pick each of these from the healthcare perspective. Physical distancing in the community. This is a very recent publication from the Clinical Infectious Diseases, which shows what happened with strict physical distancing in Wuhan, the epicenter of the epidemic. This is how the epidemic has progressed as a curve. The lockdown was initiated here, and what you see after the lockdown is a dramatic decline really in cases. So strict physical distancing really helps, and this is an epidemiological kind of strong proof to suggest that. Another city which was near to Wuhan, you again from the same paper see, as soon as you initiate lockdown, you initially have a higher number of cases. That is because you have people prior to the lockdown in the incubation period, and subsequently you have a decline in the. And here you see lockdown has been lifted after there was no new increase in cases happening. And subsequently, for a short period of time, there were no re-emergence of cases. Then we are obsessed with masks. So let us look at what are the kinds of masks we have. And I would like my friend Sandeep Salvi to have very nicely demonstrated this. There are various kinds of masks available in the community as well as in the healthcare sector. The first is, of course, dust masks, which are just cardboard-based masks, not useful really for anything. Single layer mask, these are being touted as something which is useful, and a lot of these are flooding the markets. There is no effect against COV2. Cloth mask is something which is being recommended widely. Does it have effect against CoV2? Yes. What is the effect in preventing transmission? About 40% effect. Preventing acquisition, 50 to 70% effect. Can you reuse? Yes, you can wash it and reuse. And when should you use it? In the community. So it's very clearly cloth mask, and now the government of India has recommended that everybody should wear masks, and some states have punitive action if you don't wear masks. The other most common mask is a three-layered surgical or medical mask. Does it have effect against CoV2? Yes. In preventing transmission, 50%. In preventing acquisition, 75% to 80%. Reuse only once. It's very important to remember that you cannot reuse a surgical mask. And indications is healthcare. Priority is to get it into the healthcare. And then in community, maybe if there are excessive stocks, community people can use it. The other thing is respirators, and we know a lot of respirators are available, but the most popular is N95. Obviously, it has filtration efficiency of almost 95% against SARS-CoV-2. It helps in 70% preventing transmission, 99% in acquisition, and it should perhaps be used only, ideally it should be used only as single use, but possibly when there is a shortage, you can think of reusing, and we'll talk about reusing. And indications is at present, particularly when there is a shortage, you need to only use this in aerosol generating procedures. It's preferred. Ideally, you can use it every time, but then if there is a shortage and you need to prioritize, you should use it in the aerosol generating procedures situation. But N95 masks, there are a lot of duplicates flooding the market. And this is how you should recognize a genuine N95 mask. And these are all the points which you should see. Maybe I can share the slide with you guys later to actually see what you have to check before you see that an N95 is genuine or not. There are two key features of an N95 mask: a filtration capacity, what is the ability to filter, what kind of particle sizes, and the most important thing is tight fit. And that is something which we really don't concentrate on when we don N95 mask. For that, really, everywhere if you read guidelines, they say you need to have a fit tested N95 mask, and a fit testing is a procedure, and I don't think this is available in India. So right now N95 masks are available as various sizes, and if you don't test the fitness of this, then you are going to have leakages around the mask, and the whole purpose of the mask will really be not good. So you can substitute it by what is called as a user seal check. And if you want to look for appropriate use of N95 masks, then this is the link that I have put in. This is from the Ministry of Health Singapore, which has a very beautiful video on how to check for a user seal check, as well as donning and doffing of a N95 mask. Now, this is an interesting thing which looks at facial hair. Now, facial hair is obviously bigger size than the virus. And if you are having facial hair and if you are having an unfit N95 mask, and obviously the efficiency of the N95 mask may reduce. We don't know whether this really impacts in terms of transmission prevention benefit, but this is something which you have to keep at the back of your mind, that N95 masks have to be used absolutely properly to have maximum efficacy of 95% filtration. Can N95 mask be reused? Ideally, it should not be. It should be used only for single use. In shortages, various people have tried various things. So there are some guidelines for reuse. It should be, for all these guidelines, it should be reused by the same wearer. They don't, and should not be used if there is soil damaged or makes breathing difficult. Methods include air drying, heating in oven, or chemical sterilization. So the easiest is to have 4 masks, and then you put it in a paper bag and keep it away from sunlight and UV light, allow it to dry for 72 hours and use it on the 4th day. So this is something which is being done by some of my colleagues in the US also. So they are really shortage of this. You can use this simple technique to reuse N95 masks. We can't undermine the importance of hand hygiene either with soap and water or alcohol-based sanitizer. I don't need to really talk about it in greater detail. The difference really is if your hands are visibly soiled with body fluids, you should prefer doing a soap and water. If it is dry, you can use an alcohol-based sanitizer. The other thing which we often forget when we really talk about preventing healthcare transmission is environmental cleaning. And this is important because for various of these components in the hospital environment, you need to have procedures in place. So for example, in aerosol generating rooms, you should have good ventilation available for good air recirculation per hour time, which is available before you admit a new patient. Neutral detergent use followed by disinfection with simple bleach solution 0.05 or 70% ethanol is good for cleaning hospital rooms, isolation or procedure room. Sanitary facilities using 0.1 sodium hypochlorite as disinfectant. And finally, for textiles, using hot water cycle 90 degrees with normal detergent. So these are as important as wearing a PPE, because if your surfaces are full of these viruses, then this really reduces the impact of the overall outbreak situation that can happen in a hospital. And now finally we get into this PPE business, because this is something which is being talked about lots. And what do you mean by a PPE? A full PPE would include eye cover, either with face shields or goggles, a mask for respiratory protection, a gown which is full sleeved. Then you have one clean pair of non-sterile gloves. So these are what are the components of a PPE which is recommended, and we'll see how to use this in various situations. This is a slide which I would ask you to just take a picture of. These are basically very beautiful videos from the NHS England, which talks about the ideal donning and doffing technique. And this is very important because things will be useful only if you are able to use them properly. Otherwise, then it gives a false sense of security and really may not help in the long term. The key to understand as far as preventing an outbreak in the hospital setting or in the healthcare setting is no single intervention is 100%. So you have to have a combination of all these prevention tools together so that we can achieve that 100% prevention of transmission in healthcare. So please use these principles. So in any situation you encounter, just be alert to use the principle of physical distancing, hand hygiene, and respiratory protection. So if you are able to work around this, you will be able to just simplify any situation that we are talking about by using these simple principles. So let us try to approach this in various settings. Now this whole business comes about because if it was easy, if people were just coming sick to us with respiratory complaints, then we would have been okay to triage them and take care of them. The problem is asymptomatic patients, and that essentially means that everybody who may be coming into the hospital is potentially infectious with CoV-2. Now there are absolutely only 4 or 5 case reports of clinical transmission being documented from an asymptomatic person. B, we do not know what proportion of total transmissions that happen because of asymptomatics. Because being asymptomatic and being transmissible are two different things. By and large, it is widely believed that peak transmissibility of CoV-2 happens when you have onset of illness, around onset of illness. So we really don't know. This is an open area of investigation. And it is for perhaps each of us to really decide whether, based on the background prevalence of the infection in your hotspot or the community, whether universal precautions are needed for everybody. So this, I have basically tried to use our principles of physical distancing and PPEs for each of the healthcare setups that we are going to work in the COVID era. So our consultation area, physical distancing would mean, as far as possible, telemedicine, and describing the details of telemedicine beyond the scope of my talk. Appropriate scheduling of appointments, basically trying to, at the reception level, trying to triage respiratory complaint patients, trying to, or fever. For example, fever is one of the important things. Even if you present with practically being asymptomatic, fever is something which is commonly present with other symptoms, even if there are no predominant respiratory symptoms. So fever screening and fever being asked during appointments, and putting all those fever patients together in the appointment schedule. No magazines in the clinic. If it is possible, have a separate area in the clinic where these high risk suspected patients are waiting for you. They should not ideally wait for you. Your appointment should be scheduled in a state that as soon as they arrive in the clinic, they are able to see you. And then that is what we mentioned about. So use these principles of physical distancing, and you can be innovative and creative trying to build physical distancing in your consultation area. As soon as a suspect comes to you in as a PPE, what are you going to use? The first thing I would advise, particularly for fever patients or respiratory illness patient, is to give medical mask to patients, because we really have seen that that makes a big difference as far as transmission is concerned. For the healthcare worker, if the patients without suspected COVID-19, you can use just medical mask. With suspected or confirmed COVID-19, perhaps you may need to use all the components. But we will look at CDC very beautifully has developed a grid for identifying what is high risk, medium risk, and low risk exposure. Indoor facility is, of course, as far as physical distancing is concerned, restricting entry, restricting visitors, minimizing transportation within the hospital, portable radiology, CT, MRIs, etc. And for PPEs, if you are in already, hospitals are having triaging systems now. And that is the reason why you would have predominantly a COVID isolation floor or something in private hospitals. In the government setups, we have COVID hospitals, COVID healthcare centers, and COVID clinics. So essentially, triaging is happening decent across all hospitals. So if the triaging is very good, then you'll have a non-COVID section and a COVID or a suspected COVID section, which we can call as isolation. In non-COVID section, medical masks, because now medical mask is something which everybody is talking about, to be masking yourself in the hospital always. So that is something which perhaps you should do. But if you are visiting a confirmed or a suspected COVID-19 in an isolation situation, then a complete PPE is recommended. Medical masks or N95, if N95 is not available, a medical mask and a full gown, gloves, and eye protection. And for visitors, similarly, and trying to reduce the exposure time is as important. What about OTs or aerosol generating procedures? I told you before that aerosol generating procedures are high risk, and you should not do any intervention which causes aerosol generalizing procedure without donning a fit N95 mask. For physical distancing in OTs, we are already postponing elective surgeries and should limit the number of healthcare workers who visit surgical areas. For PPEs, if you really have good triage system, for non-COVID-19 patients, you don't need to really take different precautions. For suspected patients, and especially for high-risk procedures. Now, this is from the American College of Surgeons, and they define high-risk surgical procedures as oropharyngeal, nasopharyngeal ENT, tracheal surgeries, lung bronchoscopy, GI endoscopy, bowel surgery with gross contamination. So wherever there is possibility of an aerosol generating, and you are suspecting somebody to be COVID-19, then in that situations, you can wear an N95 mask, gown, gloves, eye protection, and aprons if gowns are not fluid resistant. For anesthetists who are providing general anesthesia, fitted N95 with face shield should be offered. And during the intubation process, preferably nobody should be there in the operation theater. Now, this is an interesting slide. It's a little complicated to grasp, but this, I think, really summarizes, as a healthcare worker, what are my risks and what should I consider high risk and medium risk or low risk of exposure. This is from the CDC, which really classifies it based on patient wearing mask, patient not wearing mask. So it's very important. This very key message: patient wearing mask. And patient wearing mask would mean source control, which we always are very fascinated within the ID specialties. Source control is very crucial. If you have no PPE at all, or if there is a partial PPE without face mask or N95, that is a medium risk in the context of a patient wearing mask with a prolonged close contact. So that is important. Low risk, partial PPE without eye protection or without gowns and gloves, or all PPE mask instead of N95 is all considered low risk. If a patient is not wearing mask, then that is really high risk. If you're not wearing PPE at all, or if you are wearing a PPE but without face mask or N95, that is really unlikely and quite a theoretical proposition now. But if you have partial PPE and not wearing eye protection when the patient is not wearing mask, that is something which is medium risk. But if the patient is wearing mask and if there is no eye protection, that is a low risk. Remember, this is something which is not based on very strong evidence of these categorization, but essentially nothing is zero risk, as we all know in general. So this really triages that, and I'll show you why this is important. Low risk is partial PPE, not wearing gowns and gloves, and of course all PPE mask instead of N95. What are the key messages from this slide? Hand hygiene, absolutely critical after each patient. Repeated environmental cleaning, absolutely critical. So that two things does not take away from these exposures. High, medium risk that I have defined need to quarantine for 14 days. So these are the only people who need to be quarantined for 14 days according to the CDC. But as the epidemic, if it progresses in our country, we will have a shortage of healthcare workers if whether you're high risk or low risk. And patients and healthcare workers should wear masks, and monitoring of healthcare workers with daily temperature and for influenza-like illness is key. As we are very keen on suspecting patients and potentially considering them to be at high risk, we also should be looking at trying to make sure that we are also screened by temperature or influenza-like illness before we land up into the hospital. This is another thing which ICMR did. This was basically prophylaxis with hydroxychloroquine for healthcare workers. And that is a dose. I'm sure everybody of you must have seen that document. But I want to make you understand the process behind why this was recommended. It was recommended because this was preclinical data, particularly coming from in vitro studies of hydroxychloroquine being one of the potent compounds inhibiting viral replication in cell cultures, and pharmacokinetic data suggesting that most of the hydroxychloroquine can have a decent concentration in the lung, which is the point of entry for the virus. So this is based on risk-benefit considerations, empirical evidence in exceptional circumstances that have. But the ICMR very clearly mentioned that it should not instill a false sense of security. Perhaps it's an added layer of security up and above what we talked about in healthcare setups. Finally, what are the innovative strategies for future? Now, this is something which is already in development, and this is a patient booth where patient is being examined by the doctor. This is basically sterilized after the patient leaves by UV radiation. These are fumigation chambers using hydrogen peroxide, perhaps being looked upon when you want to put it in malls or entry points for hotels or mass gatherings, where one walks through it, gets exposed for 3 to 5 seconds to hydrogen peroxide, which is not something which soils your clothes and anything, and then you go out, and then subsequently it's irradiated by UV, and then the next person enters. So this is like just like security checks. We don't know the efficacy of any of these interventions at present, but these are good kind of thought models. 3D face shield is being developed by CSIR, which is supposed to be safe. And nasal gel is being, with an virucidal agent, is being developed by IIT Bombay. So any exposure, if it happens through the nose, the virus can be inactivated through the nasal gel. But we can't get away with the important aspect of rapid triaging and rapid PCR and antibody-based test. Using these tests may be possible. So this uncertainty that we have at present, that whether a patient is sick with COVID or not, whether is asymptomatic or not, we will decently have this rapid PCR machines coming in and antibody tests, which will help us to triage and make sure that we isolate people into particular setups very easily. So in summary, I think this is a rapidly changing and dynamic field. Most of the current evidence that we actually see are based on modeling studies, and in statistics, we have this concept of GIGO, which is whatever you put in comes out as your result. So we have to be very careful when we try to interpret results or read research papers. There are conflicting recommendations, I agree. It's often difficult to implement. Somebody says something else, somebody says something else. But I think what you should remember is, what are the principles that I talked about? How is the virus getting transmitted, and what are the tools available, and how can I apply? to this particular situation. That's what is needed, rather than having generic recommendations for different kind of settings. Again, we should remember that some of these repurposing things have really very small level of evidence, but and nevertheless we continue to try to use it so that we feel protected. But finally, I think it all ends with for an individual to really look at evidence, balancing evidence, have some logic of trying to apply these principles, be practicable, and everybody has a varying perception of risk. So essentially, this all in the philosophical point of view is everybody needs to really think about and try to apply these principles in practice. Let me end by showing you this. This is Wuhan, which reopened on 8th of April. And I would like to leave this with a positive note that after all the rigorous measures that Wuhan implemented, they perhaps surmounted. Whatever the data is coming, we don't know really, but this is not insurmountable. So we need to be we need to take precautions and make sure that we can overcome this virus. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. That was an excellent talk. And I know why it must have been so difficult for you, because normally you are a man of evidence-based medicine. Always you have to quote the evidence for something. And here you have had to use your own common sense at times. But I think what you have said really makes sense in most of the things. Let's go to people have questions. So somebody is asking same thing, hydroxychloroquine prophylaxis. Do we have clear-cut evidence? We don't.
So I think I already answered that. We don't have. There are trials going on in the US. There are at least 3 trials looking at using prophylactic hydroxychloroquine in the healthcare setups. So right now we don't have, but risk-benefit ratio and harm, because it's a drug which has been widely used in malaria and for mass drug administration as well. So I think should be okay.
Okay. Then somebody is asking, does the higher ambient temperature or air conditioning affect the thing? So is summer going to make it a little better, or having an AC at home or in your clinic, is it advisable?
At present, I think for weather conditions impacting, we really don't have evidence. There's one ecological paper showing that most of the infections are happening in cold climates, but really we don't have evidence, and we should not be using that as something which will perhaps help us in the long run in trying to control this epidemic. As far as ACs are concerned, I think over long distances, if aerosols are not really an issue, I don't think ACs really make a difference, except if you're talking about the room temperature being lower, between 21 to 23 degrees, and the risk of transmission may be higher. Even there is no evidence for that as well. So both from weather point of view or from the virus getting transmitted through AC outlets, I don't think there is strong evidence for anything.
Maybe in a consulting room, your waiting rooms, you should no longer have AC, better to keep it ventilated.
Yeah, if it is possible, ventilation is the best with the rapid circulation of air. And every, it seems 7 to 8 cycles per hour is something which is recommended. But I think ideally, yes, you should have good ventilation. But if you are, if it's this weather 40 degrees, I'm not really sure. Yeah. So.
Yes. Okay. Is the case fatality rate of COVID-19 more than H1N1? I mean, we are much more scared just now than we were with H1N1. That time people just wore masks and life continued as it is. So is there a difference in the...
Yeah, so to answer that question, case fatality rate and infection fatality rate are 2 different things. So case fatality rate is where of the whatever cases you have, how many people have died. And there is a beautiful paper in the Lancet ID looking at this, and they have come to a very good point estimate of around 3.6% as a case fatality rate with very narrow confidence intervals. So the robustness of the estimate is there. Now, infection fatality rate is where you consider all infections, diagnosed, non-diagnosed. and that is based on some modeling, the proportion of people who are not diagnosed, that is 0.66%, but that is still higher than H1N1, but it is less than 1%. So if you consider overall infections and the fatality ratio, then this is something which may not be really very high, but it is certainly higher than H1N1 and seasonal influenza.
I mean, my connection just went off, and unfortunately now all the question and answers have got deleted. So anyway, I'll have to ask you.
I have a list of questions.
I have them.
Then you can take them.
Okay, so we finished about ambient case fatality.
Sorry, I missed the thing. Are we? Is there a more of a hullabaloo made about this than we don't talk so much about H1N1 or the regular influenza, which also kills so many people every year. So, is there some hype about this, or really is this more dangerous and the whole world is at risk of a lot of people?
See, the real issue is this is a new virus. We don't know much about it. So being very confident about estimates is something which makes us feel that we should tilt more towards over cautiousness rather than being under cautious. But I think eventually even Dr. Fauci, who's from NIH, mentions that we would be looking at around 1 to 2% mortality, at the most around 1% mortality, if we are really able to diagnose all infections.
Yeah, there are lots of neurological things also coming up, so we don't know. Encephalitis, disseminated and GBS like things, etc. We'll see that query. Some people are saying maybe strokes are more common, etc. Okay, you can go to the questions.
So there is another question: what's the precaution neurologists should take in OPD once lockdown is lifted? I think I've already mentioned you the principles: the physical distancing, the repeated hand hygiene, and all those kinds of things. Triaging, making sure, because even if you have a neurologic patient presenting to you with a neurologic condition, suppose it comes to you with say a headache or something, I would essentially believe that most of them would have fever in addition. So I think fever screening should be very important for triaging apart from respiratory symptoms. And if there is a fever coming into your clinic in the neurological setup, triaging them and making sure what I talked about may be helpful. It's not possible to really talk about all situations. You may have a guy who may not come, but that will be very small in probability. So I think maybe I answered you the question that way. Dr. Kothari, if you want to add something.
No, the thing is, if somebody comes with fever and cough, that those are likely to be the patients who come to the hospital and where we have referred a patient. But in our consulting rooms, we are probably not going to see these. There may be people who are a little asymptomatic or have some mild cough, which they forget to tell you or don't really have. Yeah. But we could have asymptomatic carriers and things. So maybe we assume that everybody might be and just take universal precautions whenever anybody is walking into the clinic and keep whatever you've told about distance and asking them to wear mask. So these people should also wear a hospital mask and not just a homemade mask. Can we tell every patient to wear some sort of mask?
So right now, sir, because the government has made it mandatory that everybody should be wearing masks, these patients are going to come to you wearing house masks. The
Right.
problem is they are already exposed everywhere, and we should make sure that those masks do not become the source of transmission. So if possible, we can give them, because it's all having the virus. So if they are basically not handling correctly, then that can be a source of transmission.
So do we
So
give a new
ideally,
mask when they come
yes.
to our clinic?
Ideally, yes. So we can give them a good mask, a fresh mask when they come to the clinic, and then go away with that mask later on once they leave the clinic. So that would be a very good, because I think we have been focusing on masks for ourselves, but really patient wearing masks makes a big difference in terms of risk assessment, as shown by that CDC risk chart.
Okay. So,
yes, sir, you want to say something?
no, I mean, so the mask cost is going to get added, and the way things are going, the mask might be more expensive than a neuro consultation.
So
Okay.
this is another question about PPE use in open surgery and endoneurological procedures for surgeons. There don't seem to be uniform guidelines. I think that what I mentioned to you was there are surgeries. If it is a known COVID-19 patient, you should be taking all precautions. If there is a suspect COVID-19 patient, then in that situation, I mentioned those high-risk surgeries. And those high-risk surgeries are surgeries predominantly involving the respiratory tract or the GI tract. Apart from this, I don't think there is a risk of aerosolization. So you can use the surgical mask, you can use the normal PPE, which is recommended. So you don't really need to look at using the N95 mask. Of course, if you have access to N95, you should perhaps use it.
How does a glove help actually? I have not understood.
The glove is basically something which prevents direct contact of the fomites onto your hand. Actually, if you look at the CDC risk assessment, they don't really talk about they talk about not having gloves as part of PPE as low risk. So if you are having hand hygiene after each patient, you are washing your hands. That is enough, and you may not really talk about gloves. So when you want to triage, you can use this risk assessment tool that I showed in the slide. What you want to wear: a respirator, a mask, and eye protection if the patient is coughing are two important things.
Okay, before I forget, can you just, I mean, you are going to give us a PDF of your talk, but can you give just one group of all the links that you have sent, how to check the mask, how to wear PP, and you gave a number of good links. Yeah. Because there are thousands available on the net, and for us to find out which one is authentic and we won't know. So you've done the hard work for us. Just give it as one package, which I will forward to everybody.
Okay. So there's another question: among the basket of drugs, hydroxychloroquine, remdesivir, colchicine, which drugs have viable evidence? I think the drug which has inviable evidence is lopinavir-ritonavir. So it is not effective in severely ill patients. Perhaps there is some benefit of mortality if you initiate it within 12 days of onset of symptoms. Otherwise, none of these drugs have really very strong evidence of efficacy, and trials are going on. There's another question: managing all COVID and ILA cases in one hospital versus managing in multiple hospitals. So I think one of the important things even the government of India has done is having dedicated COVID care centers. So that is, it seems yesterday it was told that we have almost 100,000 COVID beds available right now in the setup, including private beds. And in private hospitals, you can have dedicated floors or dedicated for a small amount of patients, where you can provide care to patients who don't like to go to the government center. So I think triaging is important. Ideally, yes, everybody should be in a different hospital, but within a hospital, if you're able to triage them properly, then I think this is not an issue.
You said not to touch your nose and mouth. What about rubbing eyes?
Rubbing eyes also is a risky procedure. You can have it depositing. I mean,
can you rub with your forearm?
After you wash your hands with,
okay,
you can. There is another question about sanitization tunnels, and we have seen those things in the community. I don't think there's any evidence that these sanitization tunnels work. I heard that some of them are using sodium hypochlorite, which is a dangerous kind of a thing on the body. But remember, chlorine is something which you use for disinfecting water in swimming pools. We have swimming. in chlorine water. So we don't have evidence, but these are innovative strategies and knee-jerk reactions of trying to reduce the exposure. So how do you disinfect doorknobs, elevators, and all those kinds of things? If they are basically not soiled or dirty, then just simple detergent is enough, because we know soap is able to inactivate the viral surface. If they are dirty, then you need to disinfect with the household bleach, and that is something which is useful. The interesting thing about elevators is, how are we going to go in elevators now in the COVID era? Is social distancing possible in elevators? Assuming that we are all wearing masks, I think if possible, keeping a distance of at least 1 meter would be an effective way, even in the elevator. So I think what I'm trying to tell you is, think of a situation and try to apply the principles, and you will be able to navigate the situation. Somebody has asked, what is the current sensitivity of antibody-based testing, as do healthcare worker be tested, whether symptomatic or asymptomatic, and do healthcare worker be tested? So I think we really don't have studies to assess sensitivity and specificity of antibody-based testing, because most of these US-based testing, it is remarkable that US FDA actually gave approval to these antibody-based testing without any studies, and told them to roll it out in the community and give them feedback about the performance of these tests. And then they will decide whether it is effective or not. And if they don't feel it's comfortable, they'll withdraw it from the market. So this is something, so this is something which is happening, very difficult for us as evidence-based to really tell you something. But trying to adapt to this situation, there's no harm in really rolling it out.
There's some Pune-based lady or something, an entrepreneur who's invented a.
Yeah, so they developed an RT-PCR based rapid test. I think it's called MyLab, and it has been approved, and this can give you results in 2 hours. Incidentally, Gene Expert is also come out with a COVID-19 cartridge, which can give you a result in 1 to 2 hours, just as we diagnosed rapid TB. You can get it. So all this I mentioned along with that innovative strategy, this will help you rapidly triage in your hospital. So this fear that you are having in your mind will, in coming months, will get eliminated, because you will have better tools to triage patients in your practice.
In a consulting room, the cleaning I can understand in a hospital if a patient is admitted. In a consulting room, what do you do about cleaning? Every time a patient lies on the bed, again you sanitize it, or what?
Yeah, so then ideally you should have disposable sheets. So there are these sheets available. They are simple plastic sheets. So you put it for a patient, and after you examine, just dispose it off. So and cleaning, I think, see, when we talk about hospital infection, we talk about just how doctors should not get infected, but at the same time we are responsible from patient to another. So I think, again, if you use those principles, just navigate tools which are available. There's a question about does sunlight damage N95 mask? Can we leave it for sunlight? So I think there is some recommendation. I don't know what's the evidence that you should not expose it to sunlight, because it may destroy the filtering capacity. So you keep it in a cool place, covered in a paper bag, without exposure to sunlight or UV light. Can we reuse PPE? I think this is something, again, which is controversial. Again, we don't have any evidence for what is the proper way to use PPE. I think N95, reasonably many setups are talking about having 4 different masks and keeping them, but the efficacy we don't know. About the gowns and gloves, I don't think there's a shortage of gloves. Is there a shortage of gloves also? So I don't think that's a big issue. But for the gowns, I think reusing is something, we don't have guidelines for that. But maybe whatever normal technologies you use to clean up other gowns may be useful. I mean, again, you have to look at what kind of disinfectant. You soak it in bleach.
What if you do the same thing that you did for N95? Take a PPE.
No, here you can, if it is,
and use it after 4 days.
Yeah, perhaps possible, but hanging it in, then you have to hang it, and PP needs kind of donning and doffing very carefully. So you have to be very sure that, these things are safe to really reuse. Somebody has asked why we can't admit patients to COVID hospital and minimize exposure to private hospitals.
So simple. It's not so you will not know somebody is positive or not.
Yeah, that is one. And secondly, private hospitals also have doctors like us who are worried about themselves. So essentially, I think we should all be prepared. It's not just, make sure that, of course, we have COVID hospitals and all those things already exist. So many people have asked about the links. So
About?
links that I was mentioning.
What we'll do is also the links, we will put it on the Fine app. So people can just download the Fine app, those who don't have it. And all the links shall be made available there also. And we'll also put them through whichever, just now the way we informed about your lecture, we'll also send one message as what are the important links. We'll send it out as a message. So both ways you can get it.
The other is 14 days quarantine period enough? People are getting even after 4 weeks of exposure. In China, it's reported some patient got reinfected after becoming negative. Do you feel I think at this point of time, these are some case series and case reports. And I don't think we have sufficient evidence to suggest that because of the PCR, PCR sometimes can come false negative. So these individuals are released because they are false. That's why we talk about 2 PCRs being negative, and then really putting them out of isolation. But the recommendation is, some people say that even after 2 negative PCRs, you should try to stay at home for 7 days after a negative. So we are essentially talking about 3 weeks of somebody who is positive getting isolated, initially 2 weeks in the hospital, and then subsequently 1 week at home. But I think it's important that all of you should try to access genuine sites, genuine information to keep abreast with this. And the genuine sites really are CDC, WHO, all the index journals having their COVID-19 sections free.
No, what we are going to do is you supply us any other genuine site that you come across or any change in your advice. You send it to me and I'll send it to all these guys who are listening in. So I don't want people to keep going to the CDC and I think there's anyway too much panic and anxiety. So we should not be keeping on reading and looking up and going is my feeling. So if whatever links you have given, if you feel that you need to add a new one or some changes there, you send it.
Okay. There's a question about, does herd immunity plays any role in controlling COVID? Yes, herd immunity will play a role in controlling COVID. Now, the question is whether you want to develop this natural herd immunity from natural infection or with a vaccine. And a natural infection
vaccine will take at least a year.
Yeah, now again, this is extraordinary. Just like we saw rapid antibody tests coming out without results, this also is extraordinary. It would take 1 to 1.5 years to get results of the efficacy studies. After that, there's another layer of complexity, and that is manufacturing on large scale and rolling it out and getting it to people who need it the most. So that is something which is another at least 6 months. So we're looking at a time period of around 1 to 2 years to really have a vaccine being rolled out in wide scale in the population. So just having herd immunity, because this has been a talk which people are talking about, why not just get infected and get a herd immunity in the population. But the costs of developing a natural herd immunity may be huge and disproportionately so for our elderly population. So that is something which is very clear. So we should not be really talking about that as a cost to get over this epidemic.
Yeah, this is not like German measles that you go and purposely get infected.
Yeah. I'm not sure. Somebody asked me about use of steam for preventing or treating corona.
Many there are some people that you inhale steam and things.
There's no evidence for that.
Or throat gargling. Which
there is no evidence for any of this, sir. ACE inhibitor and COVID-19, should we change antihypertensive drugs? So this is a very interesting question because it has been shown either way. It's a double-edged sword. So if you have ACE inhibitors going on, it actually increases the expression of the ACE receptors in hypertensive patient, and that can lead to higher infection rates and severity in patients taking ACE inhibitors. Or ACE inhibitors are there, so they will block the ACE receptors and you will actually be immune to the virus because no receptor is available. So right now there is no evidence to suggest very clearly that either way it is true. And currently, I think the American College of Cardiology has got a guidelines across saying that you don't need to change your patients from ACE inhibitor.
But ibuprofen you avoid, no?
Even that is controversial. The French were the only guys who were saying NSAIDs should not be used. But the CDC and the WHO very clearly say there is no issue like that. Does a virus lose virulence after repeated infections? I mean, what will be the virulence after 2 to 3 months? We don't know really this question. Now, normally when you look at evolution of the viruses, it will not mutate unless it has a lot of susceptible population around, because it has anyway easy availability to make itself survive. As you develop herd immunity, there is selective pressure on the virus for it to survive. And if it is able to mutate at that time, which also provides it with a lot of fitness, because all mutations for viruses actually reduce its fitness. Any mutation can lead to, death for the virus. But here the virus has to, under selective pressure, develop a mutation which also makes it fit and essentially transmissible very rapidly. So I think these are all conjectures. We can't really predict something that can happen in the future.
This is a little philosophical question, but can we talk about the virus dying? Viruses are not living anyway, no?
No, viruses basically can live only inside a human body and can for some time remain outside in the surfaces. Just we talked about it. And to really survive, a virus needs a human body. Otherwise, the chain of transmission cannot happen. It can at the most remain in the environment for few hours or few days. And if there are no human beings, the virus also dies. So essentially, susceptible population is very key for the virus to propagate. If the susceptible population goes down because there is a development of a herd immunity, that will put pressure on the virus for its survival, because it would try to have susceptible population. So it will try to mutate and try to change its characteristic and still get infected and get away from that immune response that you're building. But this is something which entails a cost for the virus, that mutation. So these are all theoretical. So.
That will be the next lecture.
There are a lot of questions, sir. Are we? It's
take a couple. Just take, I think, 1 or 2 more, and we can stop.
This is interesting. What precautions we should take while going home from OPD or hospital? I think this is now. If you have used proper PPE, and we have talked about all those principles in the healthcare setups, there are 2 possibilities you can further do to improve. One is if you can have a change of clothes in the healthcare sector itself. So in hospitals, for example, you can have a different set of clothes. You come in, you change your clothes, and then you work in the hospital. And when you go out of the hospital, you can have your own clothes. If that is not possible, then you can go home and make sure that you you maintain social distance at home. So again, we are going through those same principles and assuming that there is an asymptomatic shedding happening. So you go home, try to maintain social distance initially, go to the restroom, remove all your clothes, immediately process it with detergent, and have a shower maybe. I think then you're fine. I don't think you should be worried about anything.
Okay, I think.
Yeah, it's
one last question.
Yes,
if PPE is not there, can you use a surgical gown?
Surgical gown, if you want to really philosophically think, I think it should be fine. Because what you're trying to do is what is the purpose of a gown? That your cloths should not get soiled with the droplets. And if it's something which is there, which is preventing as a barrier, it should be fine. It's not really recommended, but it should be fine. The problem is if it gets wet or something, you know, because it's finally made up of pervious material. That is something which is not advisable, and that is the reason why surgical masks or surgical gowns are not really recommended. But in the presence of shortages, as a last resort, philosophically speaking, I think the purpose is achieved. That droplets may just settle on the cloth.
And for a consulting room like situation, maybe it might be easy to wear just a surgical gown, remove it, and give it for cleaning. Because PPEs, I don't know. I've never seen a PPE,
very, very
but it
difficult.
looks as if you are going to get cooked in a PPE.
Yeah. So if you really ask me, I would really be using in the OPD setup for triaging situation when I'm considering high risk patient. So certainly a surgical mask. I will look at hand hygiene, repeat, maybe gloves, and maybe eye protection. I would not be worried much about gowns and in the OPD settings.
And what about your staff? What will you ask them to wear?
For all the staff, we already have an SOP in place. So in the reception area, we have 1 feet distance. We have kept a layer of chairs in front of the reception area, so no patient comes to the table. Or you can use a barrier in the reception area. All the people have masks. And I've given medical masks to them, the triple layered mask.
But your patients, how do you ask them to wear a mask and come, or what?
So at the security level only. Now, right now we have very less patients.
Right.
So we are hardly seeing 3 or 4 patients in a day. So it's not a problem. But the plan is that if you have my reception is now tuned to ask for fever and cohort all those appointments. Now, once those guys are coming after say 5 p.m. in the evening, the security hands over masks outside the clinic. And I have a big area outside the clinic, which is a waiting area, which is open ventilation. So all of those, if they are waiting outside, will wait in the outside area, while low risk patients will be inside the clinic. Now, this may not be possible for all consultations, but this is how you should just navigate based on the principles that I talked about.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. It was an excellent talk. We look forward to getting the links from you. Yes. And send us your SOPs also maybe in that. So what you are doing, people can just blindly follow. Thanks a lot. It was an excellent talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.